Good morning. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, we welcome you to the event COVID-19 and the New Technological Normal, a conversation between IDB President Luis Alberto Moreno and Microsoft President Brad Smith on how technology is reshaping work, economies, and life during the pandemic and what comes next. The event will be in English with interpretation into Spanish. Para oír el evento en español, haga clic en el icono del mundo que encontrará en la parte baja de su pantalla y seleccione el idioma. Please send your questions to paulc@iadb.org. President Moreno, please go ahead.
Well, good morning to everybody, and thank you for tuning in. And I'm especially happy and proud to welcome, to do this virtual welcome to the president of Microsoft, a good friend, Brad Smith. There's no better guest to discuss today's topic, which is COVID in this new technological normal that we're in. Indeed, as you all know, Microsoft has fundamentally shaped the technological normal that we lived in before the pandemic. And without a doubt, they are critical in what comes next. I'm equally excited because we're today going to make some news. And this goes at the heart of the work that both the IDB and especially Microsoft has been so focused on. I'm happy to announce that we have a new initiative that will combine not only IDB's expertise and its regional knowledge with Microsoft technology and ingenuity to help boost transparency and counter corruption in Latin America and the Caribbean region. Microsoft will generously fund this initiative, initially with $450,000 annually, which will allow us to focus on several high-impact replicable projects each year. We've collaborated with Mapa Inversiones. This is something that I have to step back and, it was over 10 years ago that we saw this massive earthquake in Haiti. Microsoft quickly wanted to develop something to help, and they created this mapping mechanism that essentially helped donors look how monies were being distributed. Thanks to that, Microsoft then developed this even further, and together with us, we have at the IDB been able to track public expenditures that are currently being used in over 10 countries. And this is a great example of both the adaptability and the innovation. Take, for example, the case of Paraguay. They have taken the lead, as have other countries are following, and their effort has been actually recognized globally by the media, by both CSOs and anti-corruption experts. The topic of transparency, of integrity, and corruption prevention truly hits home for both the people of our region, many of whom experience a lack of trust in our governments, and this is probably the single biggest challenge that we have as a set of countries. These issues have become even more important in the era of coronavirus, when public resources are stretched thinner more now than ever. And as we have seen globally, fraud and corruption can divert precious resources in times of urgent need, and of course, undermining the public trust of governments. So I'm really excited about expanding our partnership because technology is a fundamental tool to help governments and citizens have more and better information. And it can also help in the development of many of the programs around subsidies, donations, and different sources of financing being utilized by governments across our hemisphere. I should also mention that Microsoft was the first private sector company that we partnered with an MOU at the IDB. I like to call it more an MODO because we've developed a whole host of partnerships along the way, and they're truly making a difference. Only a few weeks ago, we launched DigiGov, which is a platform that was developed by Everest in the Microsoft Cloud, which helps governments across Latin America follow administrative procedures and public transactions while in person and when work is limited. This has been a tremendously useful tool. These tools are just a small part of the new technological normal where the world is moving towards. in the context of this pandemic. And there's many other parts, of course, to consider. So the theme today, which is very broad, not only about accelerating digital transformation, how far will it go? The future of work, something that was a lot in the economic literature where we have done a lot of research at the bank, but certainly is going to again be accelerated with COVID. And like before, how our workforces are gonna work and how they're gonna change. The whole discussion about and the nexus between security and privacy is something that all major technological companies are working around. And finally, all of this, how does it play out in Latin America and the Caribbean? So we have a full plate for the next hour. And so I'm really, really privileged to welcome Brad, and over to you, and we can start this conversation. And again, thank you for being with us.
Well, no, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And before we begin, let me say thank you more broadly for all of the work of the IDB and really your personal leadership on fighting corruption. I know it's been a personal cause for you for a number of years. I think for us at Microsoft, it's one of the important issues and causes for this decade. I know we'll have an opportunity to talk more about it, but I think it's one of the best possible ways for us to build on the long-term, really long-standing partnership between Microsoft and the IDB. We're delighted to be able to take this step today.
This is great. Brad, let's start by talking a little bit. You've done so many things across education, small businesses, but let's concentrate on small businesses for a minute. I mean, these are essentially the biggest source of jobs across Latin America. And now, how do they adopt to digital technologies? What are you seeing as some of the options and the things that you're developing across this area, which is going to be key in not only in Latin America, but really across the world to be able to get jobs back up again and get our economies going?
Well, the first thing we're seeing in the middle of this COVID crisis is the need for more businesses, small and large, but perhaps most acutely small businesses, to find new ways to engage in remote activity. We're still in a period of time where countries are in lockdown or they're in and out of lockdown. And even when you come out, you can't assume that you'll stay out. And so there's simply an imperative for businesses to be able to operate with more digital technology in the past. Now, to some degree, there are businesses that are connected by broadband and there are businesses that are not. And that's not fundamentally a business decision. It's really a reflection of whether the infrastructure is in place. And for Microsoft as a company, we need to work with both of those scenarios. If a business is in a location that has access to high quality and inexpensive broadband, that in some ways, frankly, makes it easier to use our latest cloud-based services. But we've all come from a past that was not grounded in broadband. As a company, we've always been very focused on sort of hybrid computing, meaning you could rely on computing power in a data center, or you could rely on computing power on your own desk or your own server room. And our long-term vision technologically is what we call an intelligent cloud, meaning lots of intelligence in the cloud itself, but also an intelligent edge, lots of devices that have computing power that are smaller, that are more remote. And so what we're really needing to do is work with businesses very quickly to accelerate their digital adoption, do it in the cloud or at the edge, and then frankly add the skills for their employees to be able to deploy and use this technology every day. So when you put it all together, in part there's an infrastructure issue around broadband, in part there's a deployment issue for businesses themselves, and in part there's a skilling issue, which is for frankly all of us as individuals, as well as for businesses themselves.
Brad, let's talk about that. There's a number of parts to your answer. I want to come back to the whole question of skills and really 21st century skills. But before that, what I find in many Latin American countries is that you go to the capital cities and you typically have access to some form of broadband. But as you get away from those big cities, you start to see, a downward trend, and a problem where if you have access to broadband, it can be very slow and very costly. Looking forward, clearly, when people have to be perhaps more in remote areas, which are perhaps, let's call them the green areas, where it's easier to at least stop the contagion and the spread of the virus, what kinds of things do you think are there available for governments to accelerate that penetration of bandwidth? We've, devoted a lot of time, and we've actually done a lot of analytical work that demonstrates that, for instance, for every 10% of increase of bandwidth in any one country, you get a pickup of close to 3.5% just on productivity. And I think the question of productivity, which was there before COVID, we've actually seen through teleworking a huge increase in productivity. So how do you see that? And what would you be if you had the opportunity to have a minister of communications or a head of state to think about this? How should they be thinking about this, acceleration of digital tools, which are going to be critical for big systems, name it education, health, you name it?
Well, the good news is the technology for broadband deployment in rural areas has been improving rapidly. And interestingly, this is a conversation that we've been having as a company, that I've been having personally with heads of state and other ministers across Latin America. The first key, I think, is to recognize that wireless technology is always faster and cheaper to deploy than any technology that it requires that you put a cable in the ground or a wire on the pole. We've seen this for 100 years. We saw it for electricity, we saw it for the telephone, and how much harder it was to reach everyone than, say, radio or television, because radio and television spread wirelessly. Well, interestingly, when we look at broadband technology today, you can choose between wired and wireless. For the last decade, people have largely thought about sort of fiber optic cable as the gold standard. It works very well, it has high bandwidth, but it is extremely expensive, and it's really prohibitively expensive in most rural areas, even in developed countries. So what do? Well, interestingly, over the last decade, there has been a huge advance in what's called TV white spaces. This is a wireless technology, and it uses the same part of the spectrum that terrestrial television has long used. If you just think about, say, growing up in the 60s or 70s or in rural areas more recently, people were still able to get a television signal with a television antenna, because the part of the spectrum that television used basically uses signals that travel a long distance. They go over hills, they go through trees. Well, there's enough of that spectrum available that we can now deploy it for broadband connectivity as well. So the technology has matured. And interestingly, there are governments in Latin America that recently have really been at the forefront of adopting the so-called TV white spaces spectrum to reach more rural areas. In Colombia, we're working with the government on an initiative started last year, happily, to bring broadband to 4 million new people in very remote areas. So I think the first thing that should be considered is an acceleration of this kind of bandwidth, this kind of spectrum and technology. I think as we look ahead a few years, there's a good chance that we can couple that perhaps with low Earth orbiting satellites and have a second wireless solution available as well. But I just think we have to change our mindset and not think of cables under the ground as the way to connect every rural village in Latin America or the world.
And when you think about small enterprises like we were talking earlier, and look at this challenge between the connectivity and the broadband, how do you see kind of the possibilities of incorporating more small businesses to be able to use broadband better, and what should they do first?
Well, the first question for any business is sort of the obvious one, to figure out what connectivity options are available. You can't use something if it's not there, but it's a good time to look around and ask, because I do think in many places, what's available in July of 2020 is a good deal better or different from July of 2019, just a year ago. So, that would be, question one in terms of connectivity. I think question two is just then to figure out how to optimize the use of whatever it is that is available. This is obviously a bit of a cost-benefit analysis for every business, but I do think it is increasingly difficult to operate a business without some kind of higher speed connectivity. Once one has a sense of then what's available, I think that the next question is really to think about, how to digitally transform yourself. What can you, use in an easy to implement way? Because obviously a small business, isn't going to have access to a large IT staff. To what extent can it nonetheless put to work, more advanced digital marketing, customer sales, customer support? I think especially in the marketing, sales, and support area, these are opportunities for small businesses to reach a larger market. Clearly in the world of sort of financial analysis and financial bookkeeping, there are huge opportunities for more efficiency and frankly, just more accuracy and better predictions for small businesses in this space. And then people can decide. The good news is the same technology, at least in broad terms, is typically available either in the cloud or on a server computer or a desktop. So I think you can do more. You can do it faster and less expensively if you can use it in the cloud. That would always be our first recommendation. I think it has better security as well. But even if there's not broadband connectivity to the cloud, that isn't the end of the story. There's a lot more digitally that small businesses can adopt.
Brad, let me ask you something that I know Microsoft, for all these years that we've been working together, and even before that, you always had a focus on how do you rethink education. And certainly as we think today of what this new social contract looks like, clearly one of those verticals, one of the key pieces is going to be education. As I see it with members of our staff, people who have, kids that are not being able to go to school are gonna have to be confined to home. And essentially all of these are areas which do not help economic growth necessarily, because they're basically disallowing people to really be able to do much more. I mean, teleworking clearly is a part of the answer, but you need people to be able to liberate all that energy that they have. How are you thinking in this moment, with all the experience that you've developed over the years in the classrooms, in the way you thought about the connectivity between teacher and students? How are you seeing kind of the changes that you can introduce going forward on education?
Well, the first thing that I think is worth acknowledging is that COVID-19 has created perhaps a greater crisis for education than almost any part of society. And when you think back about it, we've spent the last 20 years figuring out how to bring digital technology better into the classroom, as well as how to use digital technology to, say, connect parents perhaps or school children after school, with the resources so they could study and continue to do well. But all of a sudden we're having societally around the world to frankly address something that we were not even seeking to address, namely to take all education online. And I think there has been a lot of learning. Now, the first thing I think people are learning in most countries is, perhaps not surprisingly, this kind of online experience is easier for students who are a little bit older than our youngest students. The notion of teaching 5-year-olds to, say, 10-year-olds, through online education is almost mission impossible. It just is very, very hard. You know, so as we're seeing, you know, schools plan for, say, you know, September in the Northern Hemisphere, what you tend to now see emerge is a pattern where they're going to prioritize bringing the youngest students back into the classroom. And then if they don't have space for all of the students to preserve social distancing, the older students will be online. So that's, first of all, a key piece of learning that is both a reflection of technology and, frankly, a reflection of humanity. You know, it just shows that there are certain things you can do through technology, and certain things are just almost you know, difficult or impossible. And so, even though I come from a tech company, I think it's always important to ground ourselves in, you know, the human problems we're trying to solve, and then understand technology's limitations. Then we can go to work and figure out how to get the best use of technology to solve this problem as much as possible. And there, I think that there are a couple of things that are emerging as important lessons. First, you know, we are rapidly innovating with our products, say Microsoft Teams, with a real eye towards making a classroom a better experience for students that are online. Just 2 days ago, for example, we unveiled a new mode called Together Mode. And basically, instead of keeping us all in our squares, it uses the virtual backgrounds and puts everybody in chairs next to each other. It can be the chairs of the classroom with a photograph that was taken from the classroom, to try to, you know, make the experience more natural. We're adding features to provide teachers with more feedback from the students, and, you know, better ways to connect with the students. One of the things I am just finding constantly talking to people around the world is when you talk to, say, teachers or perhaps professors at a college, there's two problems they highlight more than anything else. They're having a hard time assessing how the students are doing, and they're having a hard time assessing how they're doing. And so the more we can improve the technology to strengthen these connections with new innovations, I think the better off we will be. Now, at the end of the day, we then have to keep in mind this other fact of life. A student, even in an urban center, you know, cannot connect if the student doesn't have a device, or if the student's family doesn't have a broadband subscription. So we still face this enormous digital divide. And, you know, we're going to have to accelerate efforts even in urban areas to figure out how to meet that need as well. But, you know, we are, you know, the good news is work is moving forward quickly. I think what remains very daunting is this is just this is so clearly the most acute educational crisis that we've ever faced as a planet in our lifetime.
Oh, this is fascinating what you say, and I can't help but ask you the following as I listen to you. You know, we're coming out of this, certainly one looks at Latin America, but probably in other countries as a whole, as we're currently seeing, is these huge levels of unemployment. We already see many US big corporations having to furlough a lot of people simply because the business has become smaller. And yet those people, there will probably be jobs, new kinds of jobs that require new kinds of skills, which is another area that I'm sure you're also equally thinking about. And as I listened to you, you were saying it's probably the older people who have the capacity to learn more using these kinds of tools. How are you thinking of those skills, let's call them, of the 21st century, which are related more, you know, perhaps to STEM or, you know, services that can be deployed across different platforms, and the learning that people are going to have to do, which at the same time requires some form of internship in a company that allows them to use those skills and to put them to practice much quicker?
We just launched as a company 2 weeks ago a global skilling initiative. What we're trying to do, what we think we can do, is bring meaningful digital skilling help to 25 million people worldwide by the end of 2020. And there were a few things that we focused on in particular. The first is sort of grounding ourselves in the nature of the problem. We are seeing this global surge in unemployment. We're estimating that we may see 250 million people unemployed during the course of 2020. So it's another really acute problem. What we've done with LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is part of Microsoft, is really draw data from the LinkedIn economic graph. LinkedIn has more than 650 million members worldwide. So it gets a lot of visibility to the kinds of jobs that people are seeking, the kinds of jobs that employers are seeking to fill, the kinds of skills that employers are looking for when they're doing that kind of hiring. And so we first grounded ourselves in this data and the kinds of jobs that we believe are going to be most in demand. And it's interesting. The first thing you see is that there's a real mixture. Some of these jobs that we think are going to be most in demand, not surprisingly, are more digitally focused jobs. We estimate that by 2025, globally, there will be 149 million new jobs in digital fields. It starts with sort of software development, but it includes data science, the protection of security, privacy, and the like, a variety of fields. And you see that in the jobs that are open and in demand today. But there are other jobs that are in demand that are very familiar to probably all of us. A customer sales representative, somebody doing customer support and the like. What you do tend to see across the board, especially in the middle of this pandemic and this focus on more remote activity, is a higher need for digital skills. So I think that's really what we all need to ground ourselves in, how to equip the workforce with easier access to these digital skills. So what we've really been thinking hard about is how to make the learning content more accessible to people, including through digital technology itself. So that's what we're doing with free content now being made available through LinkedIn and Microsoft Learn. The second thing we're finding is that the key to helping people find a job faster is often to pass a test and get some kind of certification, because that's what employers are looking for. So what we've done is now take a step to subsidize these tests. Tests that were typically more than $100 are now about $15, so that individuals that do this work to master the skills can show an employer that they have it. And then connect people with the opportunity to sort of get the soft skills they need. The soft skills are frankly just as important as ever. In fact, one of the things that I think you and I can easily appreciate, given the way we're having this conversation, is especially in urban areas, if you're going to interview for a new job right now, you may be doing it by looking at somebody through your PC or your phone rather than in person. So we've even created content to coach people on the tips for a successful interview when you're doing it remotely. We've even used artificial intelligence so people can practice, and then they get feedback from a computer, a cloud-based service. So we're trying to do what we can. All of this you can find at opportunity.linkedin.com, and you'll find all of these things. But the other thing we're doing is partnering with nonprofits, and especially across Latin America. There's just this wonderful tradition of really successful nonprofit support, for people who are going through additional learning opportunities. Poeta is a program that is well known across Latin America that we've had the opportunity to be a part of for 15 years at this stage. This is really all about figuring out, what do people need? How can technology fill the gap? And then how do we partner with governments and nonprofits to really scale this the way that we're going to need to?
This is a fascinating area. And one of the things that I'm always surprised is, you look at the manpower data sets, they normally tell you that 50% of the jobs companies would like people to engage in and be part of, they don't find people qualified for those jobs. And so essentially meeting the supply and demand, which is exactly what you're talking about. We did actually a program in Paraguay to be able to determine on the supply side, which are the professions, which are the people coming out, and trying to match that on the demand side. But this is clearly an area that is going to accelerate, I think, as you were saying, because of COVID. Let me turn to something that you equally have worked a lot on, and is the issue of our time today, which is around the whole question of healthcare. You know, telemedicine was out there for some time. We developed with you the portability of clinical history of different patients. We were largely, today we were focused, for the most part, countries were focused on chronic disease. But more and more the health systems have to go to some form of universal kind of deployment. How are you thinking with the uses of technology, how to accelerate this and essentially to be able to get to so many more people at better quality? Because I think this is the opportunity again that this whole digital changes are going to give us.
Well, first of all, I think it's a really important question. I mean, obviously, COVID-19 is a health issue. And so not surprisingly, we're seeing many of the most important applications of technology in the health space. I think there are two things that are really interesting to think about at the outset, and then I'd add a third as well. But the first is this: just think about the role that data is playing today in all of the public health decisions that need to be made. Literally, decisions are being made about whether we can leave our homes and whether we can go back to the office or to a restaurant based on data. And data really has become the indispensable tool for public health authorities around the world to measure and manage this crisis. So in the first instance, we've had to do work enormously quickly to help support public health authorities create better data systems, understand what their testing capability is, understand what the test results are showing, understand the trends in hospitalization and deaths, and even to manage overall, say the hospital ICU bed capacity and the like. So our data science team has, I think, probably never been as busy as it is today. And if you just even look at the dashboards that we've been working with governments around the world to stand up, it is, I think, quite remarkable to see how much progress has been made, say, just from March to July, in terms of enabling health authorities and the public to be able to follow and understand this. I think that will be a lasting legacy of COVID-19, because what is beneficial for managing healthcare resources is really true for managing every kind of public resource. And it just helps us get our minds focused on how we can better use data in the years ahead. But then there's a second thing that you alluded to. Digital technology is changing the delivery of healthcare services as well. And what we've seen is this leapfrog in the use of telehealth services. And I would point to two dimensions of this. One is the use of automated technology itself as, say, the first layer of patient intake. What we quickly found in March and April is that healthcare staff simply didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the time to interview everyone who might be a candidate for a COVID-19 test. So we used artificial intelligence. We had created something with a hospital in Seattle, a chatbot that can basically have an initial conversation remotely on a phone or a PC with someone and determine whether somebody is then a candidate who should then have a conversation with a nurse or a doctor. And that's now being deployed literally around the world in more than 1,500 institutions, being used sort of 200 million times a month. Then the next step is the telehealth consultation itself. And I think one of the really interesting things that is emerging is that an awful lot of an initial healthcare conversation with a practitioner can take place very effectively in this kind of remote way, especially where there is better broadband connectivity. And I don't think we're ever going to go backwards from that. I think it turns out it is cheaper, it is more efficient for the practitioners. Frankly, it's a lot more convenient for somebody to wait at home if the doctor's delayed than to be sitting next to other patients who may be ill in a waiting room in a doctor's office. So this is going to bring a lasting change, I believe, in the healthcare field. And then the last thing I'll note is, 10 or 20 years from now, when we pick up a history book about the COVID crisis, I think we can assume that the last chapters in the book will be about the successful vaccines that will emerge. We don't yet know when we're going to get to those chapters. We all hope it'll be soon, sooner rather than later. But here too, machine learning, access to more data, digital technology are basically foundational technologies that are being used in the biotechnology, the pharmaceutical space, by these other industries and in these other fields. And what it really just reminds us is the way that digital technology has really become the first foundational layer for every human quest that we have societally, and why these issues have therefore become so broad and important.
That's fascinating. Brad, speaking of books, you wrote a book about the tools and weapons and the promise and peril of the digital age. And what you basically put in front is something very timely today, which is how much should governments regulate technology? And clearly, there is going to be a tendency as a result of everything that's happening, perhaps to try to alter that equation. Do you think the pandemic alters that equation?
I think the pandemic adds enormous urgency to every technology issue. What my co-author, Carol Ann Brown, who works at Microsoft with me, and I did in that book was really highlight the way technology has become both a tool and a weapon. And the tool side, in some ways we were just talking about, the role of data, the role of digital technology in advancing something like healthcare. That is more acute because the problems are more urgent. Frankly, it is more acute because we need to spread the reach of technology more broadly. But the weapon side, unfortunately, is more acute as well. We have seen digital technology weaponized over the last decade. We see it literally weaponized in the form of cyber attacks that are even launched by governments and nation states against other countries. And we unfortunately have seen a rise in that, especially say once we got to April, and unfortunately the militaries that were creating new cyber weapons learned how to work from home as well. And we've been tracking and seeking to disrupt cyber attacks, say, focused on hospitals and healthcare authorities and the like. We see disinformation spreading, even relating to fundamental healthcare issues. Some of this you might say is unintentional. It's a reflection of just the confusion that exists in our world today, especially in the middle of a pandemic. But some of it is also intentionally being stirred up by certain governments. We live at a time when there's more polarization in many countries than in the past. And some governments, frankly, are seeking to exploit that. So those are just a couple of examples of the enhanced weaponization of technology. What it fundamentally calls on us to do, I believe, is first in the technology sector, we need to keep stepping up our sense of responsibility. We need to keep doing more to address these broader societal issues, but we need governments to speed up. This is a time when I think we need governments to do more, to put in place the right legal foundation, the right set of regulations around technology. And then fundamentally, we need a broader partnership. I mean, it's what you've been championing and what IDB has been doing over the last decade, really using technology as a tool to advance development. But I think as we look to the 2020s, it is both using technology to advance development and using technology to fend off new technology threats, and do it with this partnership across the private and public sectors and with the involvement of civil society.
Thank you for that, Brad. I have a lot of questions coming from the audience. Here is one that basically talks about, that how industrialization is probably not going to come back to Latin America. And what do you think are Latin America's advantages as compared to, say, those in Asia, to leapfrog and create the software development industry that for the future?
Well, the most important thing that I would say is that smart people are located everywhere. I mean, I've seen this for decades as I've traveled to Latin America. There is no shortage of not just talent, but a spirit of entrepreneurialism in cities, frankly, large and small across Latin America. The second thing that I would note is I think the nature of software development, for example, has really changed. I mean, there are so many more opportunities for startups to gain not only a foothold, but a real opportunity for success, including in Latin America. I was struck 14 months ago when I was in Buenos Aires. There were 5 companies there that have a market capitalization above $1 billion, the so-called unicorns. Had the opportunity, say, to go to these accelerators and meet with young people starting new companies in places like Santiago or Brasilia or Sao Paulo. See the same thing in Mexico City and Bogota, really across the region. So one should not discount the opportunities for this kind of success. I do believe they are more plentiful than ever before. And it really comes back to then thinking about what it takes to enable opportunities for this part of the economy. I do believe it fundamentally starts with a strong commitment to education. And I think there are very good and strong traditions of excellent education, including in great universities across Latin America. I think there are opportunities for governments to really think about how they fuel all of that, both with support for research in universities, because so many great ideas and technology come out of universities, how they think about the financial markets, access to venture capital for small firms, and what governments can do both through regulations and programs, or, for example, the kind of work that IDB does, to promote that as well. But then ultimately, I think the biggest question, or the broadest question of all, is how to use technology digitally as an enabler for every part of the economy. This decade is creating new and different challenges. Some of them are COVID related. Frankly, some of it may relate to whether the geopolitics of the world realign and what that means for supply chains in China and the like. But out of every change and challenge, there is new opportunity. And I think the key to making the most of these opportunities is to ensure that whatever part of the economy we're talking about, whether it's advanced robotics or more traditionally, agriculture or raw materials, whether these are going to benefit as they can and should from the kind of digital technology that will make them more efficient and globally competitive.
Speaking of that, there is a question about cybersecurity and how it affects Latin America. And clearly, when you observe the whole cyber issues, most of the cyber attacks, at least of what I've seen, are really in industrialized countries. But we have been, in a way, because we don't manage those huge amounts of data yet, perhaps not seen as many in Latin America. But as we turn away from the office and more into the home, the question is, how do you see the cyber issues developing, which I know is something you put a lot of attention on?
Yeah, I would say it's always helpful to think about cyber attacks and what is motivating them, and therefore what their objectives are. And fundamentally, there are two kinds of objectives being pursued around the world. One is geopolitical, where you see a relatively small number of countries, but they've unfortunately invested heavily in cyber attack capabilities. And it is true that so far, at least, they have focused more on disrupting typically the democratic processes of industrial countries. But I would not discount for a moment the threat that that poses in other democratic countries as well. Because the truth is, it's a very inexpensive way for a government to seek to create dissension and instability in a country or region. So every government, in my view, needs to be focused on this. Otherwise, you're just going to, hope that you avoid the problem. And as we all know, hope is not a great strategy. But then there's the second type of cyber attack as well. This is all about money. Ultimately, an awful lot of crime is about money. It's people trying to make money through criminal activity. And that's where we're seeing ransomware. So ransomware has really exploded as a criminally based cyber attack area of activity over the last 2 years. And the interesting thing is, you might think that people will seek to attack the places that have the most money, and of course they do, but that's really only part of the equation. What they really look for are weaknesses in defenses. And it is unfortunately pretty remarkable to see how agile and sophisticated this has become. It's a global activity. The attacks can come from a different continent. But they've become very good at following opportunities to make money, and it doesn't have to be an institution that necessarily has a lot of money because they can use computing to scale and even seek to make smaller amounts from a large number of people. And so we've seen, for example, real vulnerabilities. In some cases in hospitals and in schools. A huge number of attacks against municipalities, as well as against businesses. Here too, I just think this needs to become an area of focus across the private and public sectors. I will say, from our perspective, and perhaps this isn't surprising to hear us say this, but it is a pretty strong reason to move to the cloud if a company or a government hasn't done so yet. Simply because you just think about, whether it's Microsoft or Google or Amazon or somebody else, cybersecurity needs to be our core competency. We have 3,000 cybersecurity engineers just focused on this one issue. So I do think that we see a lot less vulnerability once people move to the cloud in an effective way. But the real point is, it needs to be an area of focus, and there is no place in the world that is immune from it.
Here's another question coming from the audience. Many large technology companies are trying to pursue businesses in Latin America. What makes Microsoft different, and what do you see as your value proposition to stand out from the rest?
Well, hopefully our value proposition is really twofold. One is, we're fundamentally focused on how to create technology to help other people become more successful. We're not in the consumer services space to the degree that some other companies in our industry are. We actually sort of also very much know what we're good at, and we want to stick to what we're good at. So, you don't see us, entering the grocery business or entering the shipping business or, the you name it business. And frankly, that makes it easier for us to partner more closely with organizations, especially businesses across the economy. And that's really our legacy. The company's 45 years old this year. And that's what we've spent 45 years basically trying to do, invent better technology that will enable every part of the economy, to work in a more innovative and effective way itself. And when you think about small business, when used well, technology is the great equalizer for small businesses, especially in reaching a larger market around the world. So that is what we are seeking to do. In this decade, it's not just digital technology. We're trying to harness data. We're thinking about open data. How do we help industries and businesses, large and small, share data in ways that will enable them to get the benefits of scale out of data? And then when you step back from that, when we do our work well, what we are doing is not only helping individual customers, but economic development as a whole. I mean, in a way, the reason Microsoft was the first company to come forward and say, let's partner, with the IDB, was because we saw this similarity in missions. And so it just led us naturally to your doorstep. And even today, when we measure how we're doing, one of the big things we measure is job creation, not for ourselves, but in our partner ecosystem and in our customers. And we typically aim to create as many as 8 or more jobs elsewhere for every job we create at Microsoft itself. And that's a measurement that we tend to match or exceed typically across Latin America, for example.
We have so many other questions for the audience, and I'm mindful of the time, but I want to talk a little bit about sustainability, because you really are leading by example on this. And I would love to that you talk to us a little bit of what you've already set out a goal to be carbon negative by 2030, which is truly around the corner. But as you were saying, you were founded in 1975, so you're looking equally to pay, let's say, for all that carbon footprint along the way. Talk to us a little bit about not only how you plan to do it, and equally what you hope to achieve by the way of example to other companies, because I think this is, if COVID happened and surprised us all, certainly climate change has been knocking on our doors for some time. And so we'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you're hoping to achieve with, and not only with this, but around sustainability and the kinds of things that other companies can follow and lead and follow your example.
Well, I think the first thing that's worth remembering is, COVID is the crisis for the year 2020, but climate is the cause for the decade as a whole. I just think we have to assume that we're going to be spending a lot more time in 2030 talking about carbon than about COVID. And we have to make urgent progress this decade. So what we did as a company was put together an ambitious plan. We launched it in January, where we said we will be carbon negative by 2030. What that means is that we will be removing from the environment more carbon than we emit. And then we said by the year 2050, we will remove from the environment all of the carbon that Microsoft directly has emitted since it was founded in 1975. I think that there are a few things that are perhaps most important about what we're trying to do. The first is we're really trying to encourage every institution to think broadly. And by that, I mean, not only talk and measure its so-called scope 1 and 2 emissions, the emissions that we either are responsible for directly or through our use of electricity, but also our scope 3 emissions. That's the emissions from our supply chain or from the use of our products. So when we said we'll be carbon negative, we said we'll be carbon negative based on all 3 scopes, which was a real step forward. And frankly, we're trying to use this in part to change the whole conversation, to encourage people to think more broadly. Second, when we said carbon negative, that means we're not going to count, say, the value of offsets that just pay someone not to cut down a tree. it's great if people don't cut down trees, but when you think about it, that's just paying somebody to do nothing. We actually need to do something, and that something is affirmatively removing carbon from the environment. And so that's the second way we're really trying to change the conversation. So then you get to how do we do this? I mean, the goal is for us one of the moonshots for this decade. First, it really means cutting our own emissions by half between 2020 and 2030. So we're taking a number of steps. You're going to see us announce some new steps in 2 weeks relating to, say, our supply chain, for example, and how we're going to start working with our suppliers in new ways. But then second, we're having to take new steps in the removal space, including the development of better and cheaper technology, especially for something like direct air capture. So one of the things we announced in January was the creation of $1 billion climate innovation fund so that we can invest in technologies that we believe we can then deploy ourselves by the end of the decade to better remove carbon at a lower price. And in a sense, that's sort of this other way in which we're trying to operate. By putting our own money into this, it's $1 billion, that's a considerable sum. But I think more important than that is the market signal that we're seeking to send, because we're saying we're helping to develop this because we want to use it and we will be a purchaser of it. And then, all of these things come together in a very multifaceted way. It's all going to require enormous collaboration by governments across borders. Interestingly, if you think about COVID and carbon as these two bookends, they share one fundamental thing in common. They don't respect borders. A virus like the air just spreads around the world. And so even though we're operating at a time when in many places governments are more focused inwardly than they have been in most of recent decades, I would argue that the two greatest causes and concerns of this decade are frankly issues that will require more international collaboration than we've seen in a long time.
Brad, one last question. We're coming to the close, but you're essentially a technology company, but fundamentally you run on innovation. Humanity, and you're a good student of history, every time there's been tremendous societal stresses, wars, you name it, there's an explosion of creativity. How do you see that happening from where you're at? I mean, you see a lot of things every day, not only inside your company, but around it. How do you see this process of creativity exploding, if it's yet, or perhaps we will see it in some time in the future?
I'd offer two thoughts. I mean, one is I think we are seeing an explosion of creativity in the short run to respond to this crisis. It's driven in some ways by technology, what we were talking about in terms of schools and how quickly they're changing. What we're talking about in terms of healthcare and how that's changing. Fundamentally, it's all being driven by data. And I think what we would say is the more creativity can be grounded in the use of data, the more sustained innovation will be. And I think that is a very broad lesson for the decade ahead. But then I would like to sort of conclude where you started. There is an enormous opportunity in our view for creativity, innovation, and technology to address one of humanity's oldest problems, corruption. I mean, unfortunately, I think there has been corruption since there has been civilization. Going back, to the Middle East, and the very earliest civilizations that humanity saw. I do believe that this is a decade where we can make a bigger dent in fighting corruption than any decade in the history of humanity, if we do our job well. When you think about it, corruption thrives in the shadows. In fact, I think corruption survives only when it exists in the shadows. And we see two fundamental opportunities, I think, to use technology. One is with blockchain, for example, so that records cannot be altered. I think that will be hugely helpful. But the second is to put digital technology to work to bring corruption out of the shadows and under the spotlight in a way where it will not survive. We're focused on this, frankly, as a company ourselves. As everybody who's watching knows, look, if you're a multinational company, you have to fight corruption every day, because if you find that your business partners or your employees engage in it, you face real liability and consequences. You know, what that has inspired us at Microsoft to do is to put machine learning to work, to identify the kinds of indicators in transactions that may say there's a higher risk of corruption for this particular deal. We then combine that with the work of people. We've created inside Microsoft what we call a high-risk business desk that takes the results of the machine learning and then focuses on those transactions to do better work to avoid the risk of corruption. When this year began, we had a meeting inside Microsoft, and I said I wanted this to be one of our moonshots for this decade. And I still think it can be a moonshot, especially with your leadership and the support of IDB, because if we can get companies and governments to use technology in a common way, to put data and machine learning to work, to create more standards, you know, that will then reinforce this with common business practices and applications around the world, we should make more progress in the next 10 years than we ever have before. And we should be disappointed in ourselves if we fall short. So even while we have to fight this COVID crisis, save the planet, let's fight corruption. And if we can do all three of those things, we're going to leave the people who follow us a much better set of continents and countries in which to work.
Thank you so much, Brad, for a really, truly inspiring conversation. Thank you for your time, for your leadership, and for giving us such a great context of what you're seeing from Microsoft and the great things that you're doing. So it's really been a privilege, and thank you so much, and loved having you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for what you're doing every day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.